É uma palmar a mão direita da mãe da criança no sentido de abrir a janela e não de fechar, de abrir. É a única impressão digital que ali está. Nem há marcas de luvas, há aquela impressão digital. Isto aí é já que naquela altura em que nós começamos a pensar nos pais como suspeitos, porque aquilo é uma encenação de um crime.
He was labeled a disgraced cop. The media portrayed him as the man who ruined Europe's most high-profile missing child case. Yet more than a decade later, no one has proven him wrong. Is Gonçalo Amaral a stubborn detective trapped in his own theory, or the only man willing to stand in the crossfire of global media and dare to speak the truth? And if what he said is true, then it doesn't just rewrite the case of Madeleine McCann, it indicts the justice system and international press that tried to bury it. When Chief Inspector Gonçalo Amaral first stepped into apartment 5A on that infamous night, he wasn't met with chaos. He wasn't met with screams. And most disturbingly, he wasn't met with the kind of raw, desperate emotion he had come to expect from grieving parents. Instead, he walked into a room that was eerily still and into a narrative that seemed already rehearsed. To Amaral, the first red flag wasn't a broken window or a missing child. It was the reaction of Madeleine McCann's parents. There were no shouts of, "Where is she?" No desperate neighbors being asked if they'd seen a little girl. No panicked searching of the nearby streets. From the very beginning, Kate and Jerry McCann weren't asking who had taken their daughter. They were stating, with unnerving certainty, that she had been abducted. She's gone. They've taken her. Kate said, not, Madeleine is missing. Not, help us find her. But a declarative assumption, they've taken her. To Amaral, this was not the natural reaction of a parent who had just lost their child. It was the delivery of a conclusion too clean, too confident, and far too fast. In his words, a mother does not stay calm at 10 p.m. when her daughter vanishes unless she already knows what happened. Over the years, Amaral had witnessed hundreds of missing persons cases. He had seen families broken by fear and grief. In the vast majority of those cases, the parents were inconsolable, shouting, pleading, running from one neighbor to another, hoping for a miracle. What he saw here was different. Detached, structured, preloaded. As he moved through the apartment, Amaral looked for physical evidence of a break-in. What he found, or more accurately, what he didn't find, only deepened his doubts. There were no broken locks, no forced windows, no damaged door frames, no signs of struggle in the children's bedroom. The bed was neatly made. The room was tidy. The curtains were in place. And more telling than any forensic clue, there were no credible eyewitnesses who saw a stranger enter or leave that apartment. If there was a real intruder, Amaral would later write, there would be a trace. But this scene was clean, too clean. That's when he began to suspect the impossible, that there had been no abduction at all. As he began interviewing the group of friends the McCanns had dined with that evening, later dubbed the Tapas 7, Amaral noticed something else the stories didn't match. Jane Tanner claimed to have seen a man carrying a child near the apartment around the time of Madeleine's disappearance. But her description was vague, lacking in detail, and altered over time. Matthew Oldfield, who had supposedly checked on the children shortly before the alarm was raised, couldn't confirm if Madeleine was even in bed. More inconsistencies emerged: which door had been left open, who saw what, whether the shutters were up or down, and whether the twins had stirred at any point. These were not minor details, they were foundational to the timeline. And they kept shifting. The more Amaral pushed for clarity, the blurrier the accounts became. But perhaps most unnerving of all, there was no real panic. No one was running down the street. No one was searching the beach. Jerry was on the phone. Kate was writing in her diary. No one even knocked on a neighbor's door. To Amaral, this wasn't just strange, it was inhuman. It was as though the emotional script had already been written, and everyone was sticking to it. The story: a stranger had broken into a holiday apartment in Portugal, entered a dark room where 3 children slept, selected the oldest and most vocal of the 3, and left without waking the others, without leaving fingerprints. without disturbing a thing. It was a version of events that required almost surgical precision, and yet no one was questioning it. Amaral was. He wasn't buying the story, not because he didn't want to believe the worst could happen, but because it simply didn't fit the evidence. "I'm not against the parents," he later said. "I'm against the lie." He began to suspect that the abduction by child predator narrative had been set in motion too quickly, too broadly, and with too much media orchestration. Even before forensic teams had fully examined the scene, spokespersons were telling international media that Madeleine had been kidnapped by a predator. Photos were circulated, posters printed, TV interviews booked. There was a growing sense that this wasn't just a missing child case, it was a global campaign. And Amaral was being pushed to accept a theory that, to him, lacked the most basic ingredient proof. He didn't rule out the possibility of an abduction entirely. But he saw it as a hypothesis, not a fact, and it was a hypothesis not supported by the scene before him. What was supported, however, was another possibility, one much darker and much harder to accept. That Madeleine may have died in that apartment. That her death may have been an accident or a tragic miscalculation. That someone may have panicked and tried to cover it up. Amaral knew the implications. He knew where that line of thinking led, but for him, the role of a detective is not to protect reputations. It is to follow the evidence. "I had two things," he said. "The crime scene and the timeline. That's where I started. And the trail didn't lead out of the apartment. It led back inside. In the eyes of many, Gonçalo Amaral would become a villain, a disgraced officer, a reckless theorist, an enemy of grieving parents. But in his own eyes, and perhaps in the eyes of those still questioning the case after all these years, he was simply the first man willing to stop and say, what if the truth is not what we were told?" For Gonçalo Amaral, the investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance never followed the path of least resistance. While the media latched onto the image of an innocent child stolen from her bed, and the world rallied behind a story of abduction, Amaral walked into apartment 5A and saw something else. Something that didn't add up, and something that most people were not ready to admit. From the outset, Amaral chose not to adopt a theory. He chose evidence, and the evidence began whispering contradictions almost immediately. As lead coordinator of the Polícia Judiciária's investigation, Amaral had worked on countless criminal cases involving death, deception, and disappearance. But few scenes had ever struck him as so meticulously sterile, yet emotionally hollow. There was no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no panicked parents racing through the complex yelling their child's name. There was instead a fixed narrative, delivered early and confidently. Madeleine had been abducted. But Amaral had a rule: stories don't lead an investigation. Evidence does. That principle would place him at odds with not only the family but the British media, government diplomats, and eventually even his own department. But he never strayed from it. As the investigation progressed, forensic assistance from the UK was brought in, including 2 specialized detection dogs. While the dogs themselves would later attract media controversy, Amaral's focus wasn't on the animals, it was on what their alerts implied, and how those implications conflicted with every public statement that followed. One of the dogs alerted repeatedly in a specific corner of the children's bedroom, the precise area where Madeleine was said to have slept. It didn't react near the twins' cots. Another alert occurred near a closet in the living room, a space Amaral believed may have been used temporarily to place a body. Still another weak signal came from the apartment entrance. But what disturbed Amaral even more was not the presence of these alerts in the apartment, but what was found afterward in objects connected to the McCann family. And, most crucially, in a vehicle rented nearly a month after Madeleine vanished. Inside the McCanns' rented Renault Scenic, investigators detected both biological traces and indications that strongly suggested contact with human remains. The presence of Madeleine's partial DNA profile under the trunk's lining, weeks after the alleged abduction, was a turning point for Amaral. For him, This was no longer about a kidnapping. It was about a cover-up. If a child was abducted and never returned, he asked, how can her DNA be present in a car that she never entered? It was a question that never received a satisfying answer. Amaral didn't leap to wild conclusions. He reconstructed events the way seasoned detectives do, with discipline and a cold eye. The scent traces, the biological material, and the unusual locations where they appeared didn't support a chaotic intrusion. They suggested a body had lain still in certain places quietly, without resistance. This wasn't the footprint of an outsider crashing into the apartment and fleeing in seconds. It was, in Amaral's assessment, something slower, more controlled. Something that had time to be cleaned up. He also noted something else, the behavioral responses of those involved. The McCanns had insisted on abduction almost immediately. There was no period of doubt, no public or private wondering if Madeleine had wandered off or suffered an accident. No visible desperation that Amaral had come to expect from parents in real crisis. What he saw instead was a media machine activated in record time, complete with spokespersons, press interviews, and scripted terminology, and still no physical evidence of a break-in. We found no damage, no signs of forced entry, nothing that supported the claim of an intruder, Amaral would later state. And yet, the story had already solidified in the press before we could even complete forensic analysis. For Amaral, every investigator's nightmare had arrived. The media had declared the ending before the investigation had uncovered the beginning. By now, Amaral had stopped asking, who took Madeleine? He began asking, where did she die? When? And who knew? That mental shift is what marked him not only as an outlier in the investigation, but as a target of global criticism. His approach wasn't cruel. It was clinical. In cases involving missing children, accidental death is statistically more common than sophisticated stranger abductions, and evidence of post-mortem contact, as he believed was emerging, warranted serious investigation. But rather than being allowed to follow that trail, Amaral was pushed to the periphery. He maintained that the traces discovered in the apartment, on certain personal items, and in the rental car could only have been left by a deceased person. No cleaning, no explanation, no alibi could erase that. Death is not a theory, he wrote. It leaves a trace that no lie can wash away. Soon after voicing these findings publicly, Amaral was removed from the case. The official reason was media pressure and diplomatic complications. But those who worked with him knew the truth. He had spoken too directly and too early about something no one wanted on record. From that point on, the case took a different trajectory. Suspects unrelated to the McCanns were floated. New leads appeared. Old evidence was reinterpreted. But the line of inquiry Amaral began one that asked whether the child had died in that apartment, and whether the truth had been buried was never pursued again with the same force. And Amaral himself became a symbol. To some, he was the disgraced detective, a man accused of smearing a grieving family. But to others, especially within law enforcement circles, he was the last real investigator on the case, the only one who had refused to bend the truth for public comfort. Years later, Amaral would publish his account. He would defend it in court, face libel suits, and live under the shadow of professional ruin. But he never recanted, never soft-ended his claim. He didn't say the parents were guilty. He didn't declare what happened behind the apartment walls. But he stood by one principle: that the physical evidence contradicted the official narrative, and that the case had been derailed by media management and diplomatic pressure, not by police incompetence. My job, he said, was to follow what the evidence said, even if no one wanted to hear it. In most criminal investigations, especially those involving a missing child, the detectives hold the authority to shape the public's understanding of the case. They speak to the press, release evidence, and occasionally offer clarifying statements to dispel harmful speculation. But in the case of Madeleine McCann, Gonçalo Amaral, the lead Portuguese investigator, was forbidden to say a word. Not by choice, but by law. Under Portuguese judicial law, police officers and investigative authorities are strictly prohibited from releasing any information pertaining to ongoing criminal investigations. The intent of this statute is to preserve the integrity of evidence and avoid premature public conclusions. Yet in this case, the law had a paradoxical effect. While Amaral and his team were legally muzzled, the McCann family and their representatives faced no such restrictions. They spoke freely, often and with increasing emotional sophistication. Amaral, meanwhile, could only watch as the case he was trying to solve was publicly rewritten in real time. He would later describe the experience as a one-sided media war. One side was legally gagged. The other had full control of the narrative. The imbalance would go on to define not only public perception of the case, but Amaral's legacy as a detective. Just weeks after Madelein's disappearance, the McCann family hired Clarence Mitchell, a seasoned media advisor and former head of the British government's media monitoring unit, to serve as their official spokesperson. His appointment signaled a shift, not from a private tragedy to a public search, but from a search to a coordinated media campaign. Alongside Mitchell, a network of the McCann's friends, medical colleagues, and family acquaintances began giving interviews, all with one common thread: emotional affirmation of the parents' innocence and the abduction narrative. They spoke of Kate McCann as a perfect mother, of Jerry as a loving father who would never allow harm, and of a lurking predator that must have kidnapped the child. These messages were echoed across British television, newspapers, and radio in a tone that felt less investigative and more like damage control. The public began to adopt the narrative not because of evidence, but because it was the only version available. The Portuguese police, by contrast, were unable to offer even the mildest counterpoint, leaving the public with a singular emotional script: a beautiful child had been stolen. Her parents were victims, and any suggestion otherwise was heartless. British newspapers, many of which had previously embraced sensationalism and shifting theories in other crimes, quickly solidified their stance on the McCann case. Amaral was not portrayed as a competent detective facing a complex, high-pressure situation. He was labeled a disgrace to policing, an embarrassment, and the man who botched Europe's most important case. To the British press, Amaral was not the man investigating a possible crime. He was the man accusing victims the ultimate betrayal in the court of public opinion. Tabloids rejected any possibility that Madeleine had died in the apartment, or that the crime scene had been manipulated. These alternatives weren't just questioned, they were mocked as cruel, unfounded, or even vengeful. Amaral's line of inquiry, no matter how forensically driven, was dismissed outright. And while accusations were hurled at him, he was legally unable to respond. Every time he tried to clarify, the narrative remained the same: the parents were victims. Amaral was the villain. Amaral never declared the McCanns guilty. He never claimed to know what happened with certainty. What he did say carefully, and with measured evidence, was that there were inconsistencies in the story. That there were no signs of forced entry. That certain physical traces suggested something far more tragic than abduction. And that the theory of accidental death should be explored. But in the eyes of British media, to even question the abduction narrative was blasphemy. He was accused of victim blaming, of obstructing the search, of being heartless toward grieving parents. He became a symbol not of skepticism but of cruelty. Even within professional circles, Amaral's credibility was quietly undercut. The emotional wave that followed the McCanns, fueled by media sympathy and national sentiment, drowned out the nuance of his position. He wasn't against the parents. He was against a theory unsupported by evidence. But nuance is rarely headline-worthy. As the narrative spun further from the evidence, Amaral began to ask deeper questions, not just about the case, but about the global response surrounding it. "They're not pursuing the truth," he said. "They're pursuing a more digestible story." To Amaral, the media's version of the case, an innocent child, abducted by an unseen monster, wasn't just emotionally convenient. It was strategically comforting. It allowed readers to feel outrage without discomfort. sadness without moral ambiguity. It drew clear lines between good and evil, without confronting the possibility that the truth might live in a grayer, more uncomfortable place. And it raised a question that few dared to ask. If the media was truly invested in finding out what happened to Madeleine, why were they so determined to silence the one man who challenged the official version? By 2008, Amaral had been removed from the case. His investigative line was abandoned. But the personal cost was just beginning. He became a scapegoat not for failure but for nonconformity. His attempts to voice a different interpretation of events led to defamation lawsuits, death threats, and decades-long reputation damage. He was painted as vindictive, emotionally callous, and biased not because of what he proved, but because of what he questioned. Yet through it all, Amaral remained consistent. My allegiance was never to a theory. It was to the evidence, even if it led to uncomfortable places. In his eyes, the real failure wasn't the case going cold. It was the world choosing comfort over truth. What happened to Madeleine McCann remains unknown, but what happened to Gonçalo Amaral is a lesson in how truth becomes fragile when narrative becomes king. He was silenced by the law, outnumbered by PR machines, vilified by a press corps that had already made up its mind. And yet, over a decade later, none of his core assertions have been disproven. The world wanted a child saved, a villain punished, and a story resolved. But Amaral, the man with the least freedom to speak, still holds a version of events that doesn't quite fade away because it was never about comfort for him. It was about the one thing investigators are sworn to pursue, even when no one wants to hear it: the truth. In 2008, just months after being removed from the Madeleine McCann investigation, former Portuguese police inspector Gonçalo Amaral published a book that would ignite a firestorm across Europe. Titled A Verdade de Mentira, The Truth of the Lie, the book was grounded not in speculation, but in the investigation files Amaral had personally overseen. Drawing from official case documents and his own detailed notes as the lead investigator, Amaral put forth a theory that deviated from the version of events widely accepted by the public and media. He did not claim that the McCanns were guilty of a crime, but he did suggest that Madeleine may have died inside apartment 5A and that her body might have been concealed. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Amaral's book was labeled controversial, insensitive, and even harmful to the victim. Yet much of the material he referenced was taken directly from police files that had not yet been released to the public. His critics didn't accuse him of fabricating information. Instead, they accused him of saying something no one wanted to hear. In 2009, the McCanns filed a lawsuit against Amaral, accusing him of defamation, slander, and inflicting emotional distress. They demanded £1.2 million in damages, claiming that the book undermined public belief in their innocence and interfered with efforts to locate their missing daughter. The Portuguese courts initially sided with the family, ordering the book and its accompanying documentary to be banned. But that ban was later overturned by a higher court, which ruled that suppressing Amaral's work violated his right to freedom of expression. Despite this legal win, Amaral's reputation in the public eye had already been deeply damaged. His detractors painted him as a disgruntled former cop, angry over being removed from the case. But that portrayal ignored one crucial fact: Amaral had never stopped asking questions grounded in the evidence. He had never targeted the McCanns personally, only the inconsistencies in their story and the lack of physical proof to support the abduction theory. In stark contrast, 2 years after Amaral's book was published, Kate McCann released her own account titled Madeleine. The book was a deeply emotional narrative written from the perspective of a grieving mother. In it, she described Amaral as heartless, cruel, and obsessed with blaming her and her husband. Unlike Amaral's book, which was torn apart by critics and banned temporarily, Madeleine was widely praised in the British press. Descriptions such as powerful, moving, and courageous flooded headlines. The book was prominently featured on major news networks like BBC, Sky News, and ITV. It was treated not just as a memoir, but as a moral document above scrutiny, beyond reproach. No one asked whether this public retelling of her perspective might also impact the investigation. No one questioned whether it might shape public opinion in a way that could obscure objective truth. And yet, this is precisely what Amaral had been accused of doing. The disparity was hard to ignore. Amaral repeatedly asked one simple question: why am I, the lead investigator, not allowed to share what I witnessed? His role in the case had given him first-hand access to evidence, interviews, and forensic reports. But in the court of public opinion, he was not seen as a credible narrator. Meanwhile, Kate McCann, who had been a direct subject of the investigation, was offered sympathetic airtime and book deals. The difference wasn't just in tone, it was in who was allowed to speak. And the implications went beyond narrative control. Amaral publicly questioned how millions of pounds in donation funds, raised under the assumption that Madeleine was still alive, were being used. If Madeleine died early on, he asked, where did the donation money go? He didn't accuse anyone of fraud. He simply challenged the foundation of a public campaign that had received over £2 million in donations. His question was pointed but valid. If the story was built on an incorrect assumption, what else might also be based on fiction? This question, like many others Amaral posed, was drowned out in a sea of personal attacks. Media outlets didn't counter his ideas with evidence. They dismissed him outright. They called him a failed detective, a bitter man, cold and calculated. His qualifications, his service record, his access to the full investigation, none of it mattered. What mattered was that his theory contradicted the emotionally compelling narrative of a child kidnapped by a monster. And while the media machine discredited Amaral's character, it rarely addressed the substance of his claims. No major outlet tackled the forensic alerts given by cadaver and blood detection dogs. No one explained the absence of forced entry into the apartment. No journalist attempted to reconcile the conflicting testimonies given by the top of 7, the friends dining with the McCanns on the night of Madeleine's disappearance. Instead, Amaral was reduced to a caricature. His silence was interpreted as guilt, his persistence as vengeance. The media do not refute my points with reason, he once said. They erase me by attacking my image. In that erasure, an important opportunity was lost, the opportunity to explore every possibility, no matter how uncomfortable. The tragedy of Madeleine McCann's disappearance became a story not just about a missing child, but about the power of narrative. About whose voice is heard and whose voice is silenced. About how truth can be reshaped not by facts, but by the framing of those facts. In the end, Gonçalo Amaral's story is not simply about a controversial book. It is about the right to ask questions. It is about what happens when the pursuit of emotional comfort outweighs the pursuit of truth. And it forces us to confront an unsettling possibility that justice, in the eyes of the public, may not be about evidence at all, but about which story is easier to believe. In the early stages of the Madeleine McCann investigation, Gonçalo Amaral was a leading figure in the search for answers. A seasoned Portuguese detective, Amaral approached the case with the rigor of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by criminal missteps. But after weeks of investigation, one thing became increasingly clear to him. There was no evidence supporting a break-in or abduction. No signs of forced entry. No witness accounts of strangers fleeing the scene. No disorder typical of an intruder's struggle. And that silence, the absence of physical chaos, began to speak loudly. It was then that Amaral did what few investigators dared to do. He turned his focus inward, toward those closest to the child. Specifically, he began scrutinizing the group known as the Tapas 7 Friends of the McCanns, who had dined with them that night, and who shared child-checking duties during the evening hours. Amaral noticed several red flags within their statements: timeline inconsistencies, contradictory descriptions of door positions, window coverings, and the precise sequence of events. The more he examined, the more the details unraveled. Faced with such discrepancies, Amaral proposed a logical next step: reconstruct the evening of May 3, 2007. His plan was to have all the British witnesses Kate and Jerry McCann included participate in a reenactment at the resort. The goal was not to accuse but to verify. Could the timeline they described realistically support their version of events? Could each parent have physically checked on their children at the times they claimed, given the layout of the resort? The response, however, was a wall of refusal. Every single British witness declined to participate in the reenactment. For Amaral, this wasn't merely a setback, it was a pivotal moment that cast deeper suspicion on those he had begun to question. If their story was solid, why resist a controlled reenactment? What was it they feared might come to light? Shortly thereafter, Gonçalo Amaral was removed from the investigation. The official reason cited had nothing to do with Madelein's case directly. He was criticized over unrelated remarks in another investigation. But the timing was impossible to ignore. His dismissal came almost immediately after he began to publicly doubt the abduction theory and instead suggested that Madeleine might have died in the apartment, perhaps accidentally, and that her death had been concealed. With Amaral's suspension came a severing of access. He was no longer allowed to consult case files, review ongoing findings, or speak publicly as an investigator. The silence imposed on him stood in stark contrast to the media presence of the McCanns and their network. And yet, Amaral refused to disappear. Instead, he published a book, The Truth of the Lie. The book laid out the internal contradictions, the suspicious refusals to cooperate, and the evidence that pointed not to an outside predator, but to a tragedy potentially staged to look like an abduction. Though the book was instantly labeled controversial, its content was largely drawn from official investigative material that had not been disclosed to the public. Amaral did not accuse anyone of murder, but he made clear that the abduction narrative did not match the facts. This step triggered legal retaliation. The McCanns sued Amaral for defamation, claiming his book caused emotional distress and undermined the search for their daughter. Amaral was ordered to stop distribution and faced millions in potential damages. However, Portugal's higher courts eventually sided with Amaral, citing freedom of expression and ruling that his theories based on real investigative work had a right to exist in public discourse. Still, the damage to his reputation had been done. The British press depicted him as a bitter, disgraced detective with a vendetta. His image became the focus of most coverage, rather than the substance of his arguments. Few publications chose to examine the evidentiary claims in his book. No one refuted the inconsistencies in the top 7 statements. No one offered alternative explanations for the evidence discovered by cadaver and blood detection dogs. Instead, the conversation was diverted toward whether Amaral had a grudge. Amaral, however, remained consistent. He posed a chilling question to the media and to the public. Does anyone really want to know the truth? Or do they simply want a clean ending with a conveniently dead suspect? This question strikes at the heart of why Amaral's removal from the investigation was so alarming. He was not ousted because he planted false evidence or harassed the family. He was sidelined because he asked the wrong questions that could not coexist with a narrative already set in motion by the media and reinforced by international sympathy. The broader implication of Amaral's story is deeply unsettling. It suggests that in some criminal cases, particularly those that attract international attention, truth is not always the goal. Sometimes, closure is manufactured. Sometimes, public relations takes precedence over raw facts. And when that happens, investigators who pursue uncomfortable leads become threats to the story, not allies to the truth. To this day, no one has been charged in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. No physical evidence has ever proven the abduction theory, and no suspect has been definitively linked to her fate. Amaral's questions remain unanswered, lingering in the background like static in a narrative that demands resolution. But perhaps the most important legacy of Amaral's involvement isn't whether he was right or wrong, it's that he insisted on asking the hard questions when everyone else was looking the other way. And for that, he paid the price not just professionally, but publicly. Because sometimes, the real crime isn't what happened to the victim. It's what happens to the truth. In the ever-shifting narrative surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, one name emerged over a decade, later like a specter from the shadows: Christian Bruckner. The German drifter, a convicted offender with a long criminal record, was suddenly cast in the role of the prime suspect by both German prosecutors and a willing international press. But for Gonçalo Amaral, this development was not a breakthrough. It was, in his words, a masterstroke of public manipulation. To Amaral, the emergence of Bruckner had less to do with the pursuit of truth and more with the urgent need for closure or resolution the public would accept without protest, even in the absence of evidence. Bruckner, Amaral noted, was a tailor-made villain. He checked every box that a media-driven investigation could ask for. He was foreign, mysterious, and carried the dangerous allure of a known predator. His criminal history included offenses against children, aligning perfectly with the long-standing abduction narrative. He had lived in Praia da Luz around the time of Madeleine's disappearance in 2007. He was transient, elusive, and perhaps most conveniently of all, in no position to speak for himself. Amaral described Bruckner as the perfect monster, not because he believed him guilty, but because his profile provided everything the press and authorities needed to shift the spotlight away from more uncomfortable questions. Yet, for all his notoriety, what Bruckner lacked was the one thing that truly mattered: evidence. Despite extensive international cooperation and years of retrospective data mining, no physical proof, no forensic trace, and no credible witness testimony had emerged to directly tie him to Madeleine's disappearance. For Amaral, this was a critical flaw that the public was being asked, if not coerced, to ignore. He warned that the narrative was now driven by optics and emotion, not the rigors of investigative procedure. One element that deeply troubled Amaral was the suspicious presentation of key visuals tied to Bruckner, specifically the image of a Volkswagen van he was said to have used. According to Amaral and several independent forensic image analysts, the photograph released by German authorities bore telltale signs of digital manipulation. The vehicle's license plate had been unnaturally blurred, raising questions about whether the original content had been altered or redacted. The image itself was of poor resolution, heavily compressed, and stripped of metadata, making it impossible to verify its origin, date, or location. Such inconsistencies, Amaral argued, were not innocent oversights. They suggested that even the visual evidence was being carefully curated not for investigation, but for persuasion. Are we really presenting evidence? He asked. Or are we manufacturing certainty? More troubling for Amaral was the realization that Bruckner's greatest qualification as a suspect was not his proximity to the crime scene or his criminal profile. It was his silence. Incarcerated in Germany for unrelated crimes, Bruckner had refused to cooperate with the investigation. He had no press allies, no legal team mounting a public defense, and no family members advocating for his innocence. In Amaral's view, this silence was exploited as a strength rather than a weakness. Bruckner could not contradict the story. He could not derail the narrative with inconvenient facts. He was a scapegoat designed to remain conveniently mute. Amaral was not alone in this view. Legal experts and journalists noted how the case against Bruckner was unusually one-sided. No public charges were initially filed, yet the press had already labeled him guilty in the court of public opinion. Statements from German prosecutors were often vague, laced with phrases like, "We are certain," and "We believe," but devoid of concrete facts. For Amaral, the subtext was clear: this was not an investigation in search of proof, it was a story in search of a conclusion. The fundamental question Amaral raised was not whether Bruckner was guilty, it was whether guilt even mattered. He posed a chilling query to both the media and the institutions handling the case. Does this investigation want a real suspect or just a name? A name that was far enough removed from the original investigation to avoid scrutiny of earlier police work. A name that would not reopen questions about the McCann family's timeline, the inconsistencies among the Tapas 7, or the forensic alerts in Apartment 5A. a name that could be used to finally close the case in the public's mind without the discomfort of revisiting old truths. According to Amaral, a perfect suspect in such a narrative must meet 3 core criteria. First, they must be distant geographically, socially, and emotionally disconnected from the central figures of the case. This ensures that their guilt can be explored without implicating those once shielded by political and media influence. Second, they must be silent, either deceased, incarcerated, or so thoroughly demonized that their voice no longer matters. Third, they must be terrifying. Their criminal history must be so dark, so grotesque, that the public's emotional response short-circuits their critical faculties. Bruckner, tragically and perfectly, fit all 3. Amaral's warning was not a defense of Bruckner, nor a denial of the man's disturbing past. Rather, it was an indictment of the methods by which justice was being pursued. In his eyes, the moment the investigation became a matter of managing public perception, instead of uncovering objective truth, it ceased to be an investigation at all. It became theater. In interviews and public statements, Amaral often returned to the same haunting point, that the narrative around Madelein's disappearance had been manipulated from the very beginning. First, it was shaped by public emotion and media pressure. Then, by political interests. And now, finally, by the need for resolution, any resolution. In this context, Bruckner was not the suspect the case had earned through investigation. He was the suspect the story demanded for closure. The risk, Amaral believed, was not just a miscarriage of justice in this one case. It was the erosion of investigative integrity itself. If we allow fear and convenience to determine guilt, he warned, then truth no longer matters. Only narrative does. And once that line is crossed, the consequences reach far beyond a single missing child. They strike at the very heart of the justice system. In the end, Amaral's question remains unanswered. Does the world really want to know what happened to Madeleine McCann? Or are we just looking for a name dark enough to make us stop asking? When Gonçalo Amaral first stepped into apartment 5A, the scene did not match what one would expect from a frantic abduction. There was no broken window, no signs of struggle, no chaos. Instead, he found a setting that was disturbingly calm and more alarmingly clean. Too clean. This would be Amaral's first major red flag in the case that would come to define his career and dismantle it. As the head detective of the Polícia Judiciária in Portugal, he was trained not to chase stories, but to follow evidence. What he found at the scene of Madeleine McCann's disappearance did not align with the narrative rapidly forming in the media and public imagination. The apartment, where 3-year-old Madeleine was reportedly abducted during a family holiday in Praia da Luz, had already been entered by multiple people before police arrived. Friends, hotel staff, and members of the McCann party moved in and out freely. Physical evidence, if it had existed, might have already been compromised. The curtains had been touched, furniture shifted, and the now infamous stuffed animal, Cuddle Cat, had been handled repeatedly by Kate McCann, who clutched it in television interviews. No detailed schematic of the scene was created in the crucial first hours. No chain of custody was established for objects that may have held forensic value. Amaral would later describe the scene as too clean to the point of suspicion. In his view, this was not the backdrop of a break-in or a predator's raid. This looked like a staged environment, but to question that was to open a door no one wanted to walk through. As the investigation stalled and media hysteria grew, Amaral began to entertain a hypothesis that would later cost him his position. What if Madeleine had died in that apartment? What if her death wasn't murder but a tragic accident, an unintended fall, an overdose, a medical emergency unattended? And what if, rather than alerting authorities, the people present had chosen to cover it up? If it was an accident, Amaral asked, why wasn't an ambulance called? Why wasn't the child taken to the hospital? His questions weren't rhetorical. They were pointed, deliberate, and directed toward a group of individuals, mostly doctors and professionals, who he believed had every reason to understand the implications of silence and the weight of legal liability. The answer, he feared, lay not just in the evidence, but in what was missing. If Madeleine had indeed died in apartment 5A, and someone had hidden her body temporarily or permanently, it would constitute obstruction of justice. Worse, it might amount to unlawful disposal of a corpse. Amaral wasn't accusing anyone outright, but he was raising an uncomfortable possibility that someone may have panicked, that someone may have chosen self-preservation over disclosure, and that if others helped maintain the cover story, they too bore the moral, if not legal, burden. But why wouldn't someone break ranks? Why wouldn't at least one individual from the Tapas 7, the close-knit group of friends dining with the McCanns that night, come forward? Amaral's investigation into their witness statements revealed contradictions. Some claimed the apartment door was open, others insisted it was closed. One said the blinds were up, another said they were down. The times of child checks, who performed them, and what they saw did not match across testimonies. Amaral proposed a full-scale reconstruction of the evening to clarify these inconsistencies. But every British witness refused. The refusal to Amaral was telling. These were intelligent people, medical professionals, parents, academics. They weren't oblivious. If they saw contradictions, they had the capacity to understand them. If they didn't speak, Amaral reasoned, it wasn't because they didn't know. It was because they knew too much. A group of educated individuals, he later reflected, and not one of them noticed the glaring discrepancies in their own stories. This led him to suspect the presence of an unspoken pact, an internal agreement to maintain a unified narrative, regardless of personal doubts. Not necessarily malicious, but strategic, because in such situations, truth is not just a moral question, it is a social risk. Careers were at stake. Families, reputations. Each of them, Amaral said, had something to lose. And so, silence reigned. But this silence, Amaral argued, was not born of ignorance. It was manufactured deliberately. Sometimes, he said, people do not remain silent because they don't know. They remain silent because they fear what knowing will require of them. He called it organized silence. Not the result of a single mastermind, but the byproduct of shared interest, mutual fear, and unspoken consequences. A collective decision to avoid the collapse of lives, marriages, and professional standing. A silent calculation that it was better not to speak than to unleash the floodwaters of truth. Amaral's conclusions made him an enemy of the narrative. His insistence on following the trail inward into the apartment, into the inconsistencies, into the psychology of fear was seen as betrayal. He was dismissed, removed from the case, and barred from accessing files. But he never stopped talking. The cost was high. His career, reputation, and peace were casualties of his refusal to conform. Yet he never recanted. He held that truth, however buried, leaves traces. And his greatest suspicion was not that people didn't care, but that they cared too much about protecting their own world to risk exposing what may have happened. Whether Amaral is right or not, one thing remains chillingly clear. The silence around Madeleine's disappearance is not neutral. It speaks. And according to Amaral, what it says, if we're willing to listen, is that the truth was never lost. It was hidden. And that hiding, in his eyes, is the greatest betrayal of all. In 2009, 2 years after the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, Gonçalo Amaral, the former Portuguese police coordinator who led the early stages of the investigation, faced a lawsuit that would define the rest of his life. The lawsuit was brought by the McCann family in response to his controversial book The Truth of the Lie, which proposed a hypothesis fundamentally different from the widely accepted narrative. Amaral did not accuse Kate or Jerry McCann directly of murder, but he did suggest that Madeleine might have died in the apartment and that her death could have been concealed. This assertion ignited international outrage. The book was labeled defamatory. The McCanns, backed by a high-profile PR team and widespread public sympathy, argued that Amaral's statements caused them profound psychological harm and severely undermined their campaign to find their daughter. The initial court ruling in Portugal sided with the McCanns. Amaral was ordered to pay substantial damages and had his book banned from distribution, a decision that many saw as a public condemnation of a man who had dared to speak against the tide. But Amaral did not back down. What followed was a grueling legal battle that lasted more than a decade. Amaral appealed the ruling, defending his right to share insights from a case he once led. He insisted that his book did not break the law, it simply presented an alternate theory based on officially documented facts and investigatory leads. While he waited for higher courts to weigh in, Amaral became a pariah in some circles and a hero in others. His name, once associated with Portugal's judicial system, was now enmeshed in one of the most emotionally charged child disappearance cases in modern European history. In 2021, the European Court of Human Rights, EFHR, delivered a landmark decision. It overturned the previous Portuguese court rulings, stating unequivocally that Amaral's rights had been violated. The court affirmed that Amaral was within his legal rights to publish the book. There was no evidence that he had acted with malice or stepped beyond the limits of free speech. His work, the court noted, was rooted in professional opinion, supported by documents in the investigation file. To censor such expression, the court said, would be to erode the very foundation of a democratic society. But by the time the verdict arrived, the damage, both personal and professional, had long been done. Amaral had been vilified in the press, targeted in lawsuits, and financially devastated. He had lost his career, his marriage, and a large portion of public trust. Yet even after the legal victory, the world remained divided. In the United Kingdom, where the McCanns had received nearly unwavering media support, Amaral was still largely viewed through a lens of disdain. He was often portrayed as a bitter man seeking to profit from tragedy. Headlines accused him of cruelty. Editorials called his theories disgraceful and dangerously speculative. Even after the ECHR ruling, many refused to reconsider his position or the validity of his reasoning. But in Portugal and among independent investigators, journalists, and segments of the online community, Amaral's story had taken on a different tone. To them, he was no longer just an investigator. He had become a symbol of the dangers of speaking out against a carefully maintained narrative. A man punished not for lying, but for refusing to accept a version of events that didn't align with the evidence he had seen. The division was deep, and it reflected something more than public opinion. It reflected a collision between two worldviews, one that placed emotion and image above all else, and one that demanded accountability, even at the cost of public comfort. Over the years, Amaral's voice had shifted. He no longer spoke only of the McCann case. Instead, he spoke of systems, of justice, of how, in his view, truth becomes inconvenient when it challenges power. The story stopped being about a missing child a long time ago. Amaral once said in an interview, "Now it is about dignity, about whether truth matters in a world where perception is everything." It is hard to argue with that sentiment when looking at the broader picture. Despite global coverage, millions of pounds in investigative budgets, and the naming of multiple suspects over the years, Madeleine McCann remains missing. No one has been charged. No body has been found. No explanation has ever held. And yet, public discourse was quick to condemn Amaral while welcoming other narratives with open arms, especially those that reinforced the comforting idea of a foreign predator, a monster hiding in the shadows, responsible for everything. For Amaral, this dynamic was not just frustrating. It was dangerous. In his eyes, the media and judicial apparatus had created a situation where only certain questions could be asked, questions that aligned with a singular, emotionally palatable narrative. Anything else, no matter how evidence-based, was to be silenced. He posed a haunting question. What if truth only arrives when no one has anything left to protect? This question cut deeper than any legal document. It suggested that justice had become conditional not on facts, but on optics. Not on guilt or innocence, but on whose story could generate the least resistance. Amaral's journey, then, is more than a cautionary tale. It is a challenge. It asks us whether we are willing to listen to voices we do not like. It asks whether dissenting views deserve protection, even when they clash with public sentiment. It asks whether a democratic society can truly call itself free if truth tellers are buried under lawsuits and headlines designed to discredit rather than engage. And most of all, it reminds us that silence, whether enforced by law or by fear, is a powerful tool, one that can be used to protect innocence or to conceal complicity. A journalist once wrote of Amaral, "He doesn't need to win, he just needs the world to re-examine what it was told to forget." And perhaps that, in the end, is the only real victory he ever sought. Not vindication, not applause, but awareness, a pause, a second look. For in a case where almost everyone has something to lose, perhaps the one man who lost everything is the only one left with nothing to hide. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann in 2007 remains one of the most haunting and polarizing cases in modern investigative history. It is a story that crossed continents, consumed global media, and exposed both the power and the failure of institutions we rely on to protect the most vulnerable. Yet as the years pass, and as the dust settles from legal battles, media storms, and public speculation, one question remains: what can we learn from this? At the heart of it all is a child, a little girl who went missing on a warm May evening in Portugal. That fact, that innocent reality, must never be forgotten. Regardless of where the truth lies, or who is ultimately responsible, the world's shared desire was to bring her home. But how we responded to that desire, how law enforcement, media, and society as a whole reacted, revealed the cracks in our systems and the deeper challenges we must confront. One of the most immediate lessons is the importance of preserving the crime scene. In the critical hours following Madeleine's disappearance, her apartment was entered by friends, family, and resort staff. Potential evidence was unknowingly moved, contaminated, or lost. It was a stark reminder that even in the face of panic, protocol matters. In future cases, training, awareness, and strict enforcement of forensic procedure must be prioritized, not just for the sake of science but for truth. Another powerful takeaway is the need to separate emotion from investigation. The instinct to protect a grieving family is deeply human, but that instinct cannot override the principles of impartiality. In this case, many avenues of inquiry were dismissed not because of evidence, but because they clashed with public sentiment. If we are to serve justice fairly, we must let facts guide our path, not fear, not sympathy, and certainly not media pressure. The case also exposed the immense influence of media narratives. Headlines don't just inform, they shape opinion, steer investigations, and, at times, silence dissenting voices. When investigators like Gonçalo Amaral questioned dominant theories, they were vilified rather than debated. When alternative possibilities arose, they were often mocked or ignored. This reminds us that freedom of speech must include space for uncomfortable questions, especially when the stakes are as high as a child's life. Perhaps most profoundly, the Madeleine McCann case teaches us about silence and what it may conceal. Whether one believes in the abduction theory or in an accidental death covered up, the core issue remains: some truths have not yet been spoken. Silence is not always a sign of ignorance. It can also be fear, guilt, or misplaced loyalty. Moving forward, we must foster cultures in policing, in media, in our communities where truth is encouraged, not punished. Yet for all its failures, the case offers something else: resilience. Investigators who were silenced found ways to speak. Citizens continued to ask questions. Even after decades, the world still remembers Madeleine's name, and in that persistence lies hope. Hope that future cases will be handled better. Hope that mistakes made here will guide new reforms. Hope that truth, however buried, will always find a way back to the surface. Because ultimately, this case is no longer just about one girl. It is about how we respond to injustice. It is about how we treat doubt, dissent, and truth in a world saturated with noise. It is about whether we are brave enough to revisit the things we once accepted, if doing so might bring clarity to what was lost. Perhaps, as Amaral once suggested, the truth will only come when no one has anything left to protect. Perhaps silence will one day give way to honesty. Until then, What we can do, what we must do is learn. Learn to protect the scene. Learn to question everything. Learn to listen beyond headlines. Learn to never stop asking where justice begins and what it takes to get there. Because Madeleine deserves that. And so do all the others we haven't yet found.